Alright, hello and welcome back everyone. And yes, as promised in this video, we're going to take a look at adding an actual panel to our plugin to add some customizability for our plugin's users. As you might be able to see, this is currently another day and another camera, just because I had some technical difficulties with the previous setup, unfortunately, so I'll re-record this particular section as well. You may have seen that there have been some breaks already, but yeah, let's dive right into it. Alright, as you can probably remember, our plugin actually already has a panel integrated in it that we never removed. So if we go to my first plugin, we actually have this enlarge a rectangle panel right here, which was able to enlarge rectangles with some settings. And what we're actually going to do is we're just going to recycle, so to speak, this panel, so that we don't have to write all the boilerplate code we would need for a panel, but instead we'll just base it off this existing panel. And of course, the first thing we want to do for that is that we should probably go to our manifest.json file, and in here we will no longer need our menu command, because of course we just want to trigger creating our checkerboard pattern from our panel. And while this panel definition by itself looks pretty good, we actually want to of course edit it a little bit so that it has the correct label. So instead of enlarge a rectangle, we'll say create a checkerboard pattern. And instead of the panel ID being enlarge rectangle, we'll say the panel ID will be create checkerboard pattern. And with that, the manifest.json changes that we need to do for this are actually already done. But of course, as you remember, all these UI entry points also have to be reflected within our main.js file. So before we can reload our plugin in Adobe XD, we first of all also have to do some changes here. And that will primarily be that we will no longer need this commands export right here, because as you can remember, we removed our command entry point. And also we want to rename our enlarge rectangle to our panel ID, which would be create checkerboard pattern. So create checkerboard pattern. And with that, if I now save the plugin, as you can hopefully remember, whenever we do any changes to our manifest.json file, we actually have to do a full reload within the UXP developer tools. So we'll go to unload, load it once again, and last but not least, also activate the watching for changes once again, so that we can quickly reflect any code changes in our plugin. And if I now go back inside Adobe XD, we should be able to see that if I now go to my first plugin, it actually says create a checkerboard pattern. Of course, if I now click on it, we still have our normal previous create a rectangle panel, but we'll have a look at actually implementing creating our checkerboard pattern with the panel next. So what we can do if we go back into our code, the first thing we want to do, and we'll get back to this function in the next video, but for now we'll just remove everything from the update function. And the update function basically gets called whenever our selection changes inside Adobe XD. So for example, if I now select this artboard, this update function would be called. And also if I select another artboard, or if I move something around or anything like that, all of that would then trigger this. All of this would then trigger a call to the update function. So it is a great place, and you might have already been able to spot this. Previously, the plugin did some selection checking in here, and actually will do just the same in the next video. Next up, the show event can basically stay how it is, but we will have to make some little changes to our create function, which actually creates our plugins panel. And so the first thing we want to do is we actually don't really need any additional styling within our plugin. So I'll just delete all of this style stuff right here, and also let's fix the indentation a little bit, and now we're left with only our form element and our warning. And actually we don't need any warning either, so let's just delete that. And also, just to make it a little bit better, easier to read, I'll quickly fix some of the indentation right here. And with that, let's take a look at actually customizing it further so that we can then actually create a checkerboard pattern. So of course, we no longer will need these rows and columns right here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this whole div element right here, because we no longer need like 2 elements in a row. And so all we really have to do now is we have to create a label once again. So this is really just basically your standard HTML tags and stuff. And so what we said that we actually want the user to be able to customize is the number of subdivisions. And so we just say subdivisions right here. And of course, if you know a little bit of HTML, this should come as no surprise. We will have an input element. Since it's the number of subdivisions, we actually want this to be of the type number. We can also specify some validation. So for example, let's say we want a minimum of 2 subdivisions and a maximum of 32. Also, the initial value should just be your typical standard chessboard, so 8. So let's just say value equals 8. And last but not least, let's stop users from entering like 4.5 subdivisions. This of course could also be interesting, but doesn't work with our current code probably, although it would be an interesting idea to try it, so feel free to play around with it. But for now, we'll actually just stop users from entering any non-integer values. And so with that, we already have our input element, and yes, also the button basically can stay the same, because we still apply still holds true. We could also say something like create checkerboard pattern here, but apply still works. So yeah, let's just leave it at that, shall we? Next up, what we actually want to do is we want to delete this increase rectangle size function, because of course, if you remember, we don't want to enlarge a rectangle anymore. What a surprise, wow. And so with that, we actually can leave these 2 parts in there just as they are, because they still work. You know, we still want to create this div which then hosts our panel, and we just say that the inner HTML of this panel div should be the HTML defined up here, so just our form element. And of course that still works, but what unfortunately doesn't work just the way it was anymore is this event handler, because while this first part still holds true, you know, when the panel gets submitted, or the form gets submitted, sorry, we want to listen to that, so we add an event listener for the submit event. But of course we don't have any reference to this increase rectangle size function anymore. So instead, what I'm going to do here is we'll go ahead and define an inline function right here. So just your typical JavaScript inline function. You could of course also, if you wanted to write something like this, it doesn't really change anything in this regard, but I just like the arrow function style a little better for this use case. And what we're actually going to have to do is we have to call a function that's called edit document. And it's actually something that comes from the application module. So we're going to have to import that. So const edit, if I could type correctly, that would be great, edit document equals require application. And of course, since we have the TypeScript definitions installed, we should be able to hover over this and get an explanation for it. And so, as you can see here, edit document is a function that can initiate an edit operation batch in order to modify the XD document. And so basically what it does is it creates basically a time frame where you can edit the scene graph. You can't just edit the scene graph at any time, but it has to do with user input. So whenever a user actually inputs something, then you can actually edit your scene graph. And because of that, while in a command it's very easy because our function gets called just because of user input, you know, there's no problem in that sense with that. With panels, we actually have to listen to that input and then, in a sense, manually specify, hey, we now got some input, so now we can edit our document. And this is what this edit document call is for. So in this edit document, we actually pass it an edit function, which basically looks just the same as our command functions did. So we get a selection and we get a root node, and then this edit operation, so to speak, then gets called to, yeah, I guess, do whatever it has to do. And so with that, we can just now say edit document, and in here we'll actually pass it the selection. And yes, now we can just do anything we want with that selection. And of course, if we remember what we want to do, that should also be pretty straightforward, right? As I said, it's basically the same context we're now in, so to speak, as with our command function. So I'll just remove our call from down here and add it here. And now we already have our call to create checkerboard pattern. So this means that if I now were to go back into Adobe XD, and I'll just quickly remove this my command function that we no longer need, and we were to run the panel, what should happen is that we should be able to see the subdivisions right here, and we can also click apply. And if I now create an artboard, I can click apply, and it should just create our checkerboard pattern. And it does, but of course we haven't wired up our number of subdivisions yet. So if I now say, for example, let's do 3 subdivisions, and I click apply, it still applies our 8 subdivisions. So you can see we now basically have 2 instances of the same pattern, so to speak. So as a last step within this video, let's now create a way that we can wire up our value from the input field and replace our constant number of 8 subdivisions with that. So if you're familiar with JavaScript, this is really just basically your standard stuff. So all we have to do is basically we go into our panel, and within the panel we can say query selector, and we want to select, and we can pass any CSS selector here. We want to select our input element, and since we only have one input element, we don't even need any ID or something like that. Alternatively, we could also, for example, say ID equals subdivisions, and then do something like document.getElement by ID subdivisions down here, but actually we don't even need that. We can make it a little bit simpler because we only have this one input field. And so of that one input field, it is actually the value that we want to get. And if I now save this once again, and we go back into Adobe XD, wait for about 2 seconds for it to reload, and then we enter, for example, a number of 3 subdivisions. If I now click apply, as you can see, we actually get our desired result of just 3 subdivisions. And with that, basically we have our panel done. And now we can also even already go ahead and create some generative art with that. as you can see. It's also very interesting, by the way, which patterns result when you enter both odd and even numbers in this. So if I were to select the artboard once again, you can see that there are some quite interesting patterns that can result from something like that. But also you just saw what our problem is, and it is in some sense a recurring sort of problem, because while we don't get any errors, our plugin doesn't basically fail fatally. It still doesn't do anything without any user feedback if we were to not have any artboard selected. So if I have this artboard selected, no problem, but if I don't have anything selected, I can click apply as many times as I want to and nothing happens. And of course, this isn't really a good user experience. And so in the next video, as already promised in the first half of the video, we're actually going to have a look at re-implementing, so to speak, the update function or lifecycle callback, so that we can then provide the user with some sort of feedback about whether they can actually run the plugin in the state the state they are currently in. Alright, with that we actually have reached once again another checkpoint. So if you weren't able to follow along, just copy and paste the files from step 7 panel within the workshop repository. Also, please remember that when you then copy over these files, you will have some changes in the manifest.json. So just click unload and load once again. And with that, you should be set up to once again follow along in the next video. I'll see you then, and thank you so much for watching.